Welcome to Amrita sir. We are glad to have you here to answer some of our questions. So we'll get into the questions. So, what opportunities do interdisciplinary spaces like IITs provide for dialogue between modern science and traditional knowledge systems?
Thank you for that question. Before I begin, I thank the university, Amrita Vidyapeetham, for organizing this conference and also this podcast. IITs, in my limited experience of my career there, I can only say that one of the best places where you can have true intellectual freedom to pursue what you're really passionate about. Coupled to that freedom comes the policy change in the government where they've introduced Indian Knowledge System centers. So I have been fortunate enough to be in an IIT which has given me the liberty to pursue my passion, which is IKS in specific STEM fields. And thanks to the Government of India Ministry of Education that we have an IKS Center, which is a center of excellence at our IIT. So this gives you an idea of what kind of a space, intellectual space an IIT can give. What is true for my IIT is in fact more or less true for other IITs as well. So this is kind of the liberty which this IIT system does give. I am harping upon IIT system. It's not very unique to IIT alone. I'm sure many universities like one in Amrita Vishwadeepitham also will be functioning that way. But since I am affiliated to that, I have first-hand experience of that. That's why I'm harping more on that. And when it comes to intellectual freedom, it's not just opening up a center and sitting idle. They encourage us to do research. They encourage us to float courses which are aligned with our passion as well as the theme for which the center is open. So these are the kind of liberties which we see, at least I get to see in my IIT where I'm working.
That really gives a lot more insight into the kind of work IKS is doing. So, coming to chemistry, in contemporary chemistry, theory and experiment are tightly integrated. How do you see this relationship reflected or challenged when examining classical Indian chemical texts?
It's a very interesting question and a loaded question, uh, but let me break that down in multiple layers. One is when it comes to the word classical chemistry, uh, normally in our country the word classical is associated with two different domains, which are literature and music. But somehow these two are not quite relevant with respect to other fields as far as India is concerned. Especially in music it is not relevant. But when it comes to chemistry also, although somewhere it is relevant, it's a better term is traditional chemistry that has been practiced. That's one layer to understand that question and respond. The other layer is the interplay between the experiment and the theory. I would also include computation in that, theory/computation. And this is applicable in the modern contemporary chemistry that I study, I teach. Whether experiment leads the theory or whether the theory leads the experiment. There have been occurrences in the past where theoretical predictions have led to discoveries. One very beautiful example is your story of Higgs boson. Higgs boson was proposed several decades before. That was a theoretical announcement. But then the experimental observation of it came only in 2011 and 12. And pretty soon they got the Nobel Prize, people who observed it. And I think way back, I think it was either 60s or 70s that Peter Higgs had proposed something like a Higgs boson. So it took almost 50-60 years for the experiment to catch up with the theory. Whereas in other fields, other instances, there have been experiments first and then theories were proposed for it much later. One example that comes to my mind is photochemical additions in chemistry that organic chemistry students typically study. They did certain reactions and then they found certain pattern and then they formulated theory behind it. So whereas this interplay between theory and experiment is very intellectually challenging in the contemporary field of chemistry or science for that matter, when it comes to traditional chemistry, traditional material science or metallurgy, it's very difficult to give such a kind of a narrative there. And it is not for the lack of any intellectual rigor that the difficulty is coming forth, because the complete outlook to the practice of chemistry in the ancient and medieval India is different. It was not merely an intellectual or an academic endeavor. Chemistry being a very pragmatic subject, people dwelt in it for its practical purposes, what kind of products it is forming, what kind of changes it is bringing to a material. Now, whether they invested theoretical insights in understanding it and thereby came with some theoretical framework, I am not aware of it, that much I can say. I would not dismiss it by saying there is no such theory, but at least I would say I am not aware of it. There was a philosophical, a darshanik ground framework based on which this empirical science grew. That is a Nyaya Vaiseshika darshana, based on which this whole stem in ancient and medieval India grew up. But after that, as I talked about, say, this photochemical reaction leading to a theory like that, did they have any theory? I would again repeat, I would only feign my ignorance by saying I do not know about it.
Okay, sir. So, from a chemist's standpoint, how should we evaluate the empirical knowledge embedded in Rasaśāstra without either dismissing it or romanticizing it?
Again, it's a very poignant question, because when we look at any topic in IKS, I will come to Rasaśāstra maybe in a minute or two. Now, given that the government is also very keen in promoting IKS in through all the scholastic mediums, organizations of higher education as well, we must sit back and ask a question: what is it that we are really meaning by IKS? Is it an endeavor to visit history for merely extending a chapter in the textbook of history, which normally concerns war and victory or defeat of any king? Are we extending that domain of history to, say, scientific history? Is it that all IKS is about? And if you give a nationalistic spin to it, are we romanticizing it? I have my own opinions about it, and I am not claiming whether they are right or wrong. But since you have given me an opportunity, I am voicing out my opinion. I take a completely different stand with respect to IKS, and not entirety of it being a visitation to history. So let me explain that. Yes, initial few endeavors in IKS has to be historical, because from my generation or even from my one generation before me and until yours and perhaps the next, for at least 200 years in our country, from today if we go look at 200 years back, the traditional knowledge corpus that was available and accessible has gone to a toss in the last 200 years. As a consequence of that, we are not aware of our own potential and intellectual achievements which has happened in the country, which has happened in the civilizational country, which has sustained for thousands of years. So yes, initial parts of the IKS is visitation to history, to just update ourselves what has been in the past. So there there is no need to romanticize it. We must at least unearth and state what has been in the past. That's all. But there again we need to exercise caution, because right now as we are speaking, you have newspapers where news are getting published, you have research papers, you have popular books, you have scientific books, you have intellectual books. Now 300 years down the line, when some archaeologist or historian of science looks at all this literature, Would they keep everything in the same pedestal? Obviously no. So right now when we look back and look at those literature, we must also exercise the similar caution. And that's how we must separate the wheat from its chaff and identify what constitutes this true knowledge, try to understand it, and then propagate it down the line. So when we say understand it, and that's where we need to recreate. So first to knowing it, then recreating it, and then trying to applying it to modern problems. If at all it is able to come up with a solution, so be it, well and good. That's how this tradition, knowledge tradition, will be able to again live and grow perhaps.
So, in your perspective, what distinguishes a scientifically responsible study of traditional knowledge from superficial validation exercises?
It's a very sensitive question. I mean, superficial validation, obviously, it's a giveaway that neither the modern scientific methods nor our traditional Indian intellectual approach have any time encouraged superficial treatment to anything. So, from the very face value or the very wordings of this question, it is a straight giveaway that superficial validation is absolutely of no use. It's neither going to serve the purpose for pursuits of traditional knowledge, nor it is going to be serving any purpose for modern scientific standards as well. But rather, I would like to get to the purport of the question, or the heart of the question, where you want to say, how is it that we are going to accept the traditional knowledge as a modern knowledge? Is it based on the faith that it was done by ancestors, or do we kind of really question it and kind of recreate it? I will rephrase that question and try to answer this rephrased question perhaps. Very interestingly, one of the earliest, I would say, written corpus of intellectual literature that we find in our country is medical literature, Charaka and Sushruta Samhita. And like any other text, we cannot really lay our finger on an accurate date when these were composed. But still, the antiquity of this is given to at least 2000 years. Mainstream world also believes it. So even 2000 years back, there is a beautiful verse that comes in Charaka Samhita, which says that it is not by any kind of a pramana that you should merely diagnose a disease. It is by your own experience. Suppose if I am a Vaidya and if I come to me as a patient, I should not say that, okay, fine, this is written so and so in the text, that I match your symptoms with the symptoms mentioned in the text and come to a conclusion, oh, you are suffering from this kind of a disease. The Charaka Samhita, the medical literature, actively prohibits such a practice, stating that you should neither rely on the text for diagnosing, nor you should say, oh, my teacher had a similar case, he diagnosed it similarly, that's why I will also diagnose it in a similar way. This is the same text which describes various protocols of diagnostics, various protocols of how to write the text. In fact, Tantra Yukti becomes a part of Charaka Samhita, which talks about the art of writing scientific literature. Despite that, they say, no, do not believe on this particular text when it comes to diagnostic. What do they prescribe? They say you need to test yourself. You do the pariksha yourself. You do the various, I look at your nadi, I look at your eyes, I look at your palpitations, various other protocols that I mentioned, and then come to a conclusion. So the text, which is a medical literature, the guru's experience, all these are kind of not thrown out of the window. They are kept as a second rung of our support. But primarily it is my individual test and experience gained out of that test is what will make me a true Vaidya. Otherwise, this is told in the text 2000 years back. Okay. Similarly, the text also says, it's very interesting, again one more verse, it says, I am forgetting the actual wordings of the verse, but ekam shastram adhiyano na vidyat shastra nishchayah tasmat bahushrutam shastram vijaniyat chikitsakah. What it says is, if you are specializing in only one particular area of knowledge, domain of knowledge, ekam shastram adhiyano na vidyat shastra nishchayah. You will not become an expert. Even if you are pursuing only one field of knowledge, still it says you will not become an expert. Tasmat bahushrutam shastram. That's why have a very eager ear for knowing many shastras. Then only you will become Vijaniya Suchikitsakaha. Vijaniya Chikitsakaha. So a Chikitsaka, this is a definition of a physician. He needs to know many things. Samudrika Lakshana. I mean, there are treatises which goes on what all the Chikitsaka should know before even he able to diagnose. So when our texts, our tradition relies on such kind of diverse knowledge, so definitely based on faith or what you call superficial validation has absolutely no space in our traditional approach to STEM. Not just medicine, it is true for any kind of, in the case of Dhatu Shastra, Dhatu Vijnana or Rasaśāstra also, it is don't just merely believe what the text or the guru says. You have to do it yourself and find it out. Because these are practical things. So definitely soiling your hands, putting your skin in the game, and thereby learning it will what has advanced the knowledge in the past, and so also it will be advancing the knowledge in the current times.
Yeah, that's a very essential and strong take right there. So, beyond chemistry, you have interests in Indian philosophy, languages, and classical music. So, how do these intellectual traditions inform your approach to scientific inquiry?
Yep, this is a good question. It's more on my personal question, so I'll take perhaps liberty in dwelling into some personal vicissitudes here. Any domain of knowledge we take from India that has originated in this soil by our own ancestors, there is a common pattern. Whether it is music, whether it is uh, classifying plants or classifying drugs or classifying stars, there is a particular pattern that has become a common source of intellectual dwelling for various domains of knowledge. And many people try to go back to Vaiseshika, Nyaya Vaiseshika philosophy, and that's how they see the commonality. Obviously, I mean, being born in this country, you are naturally gifted with certain inputs. No matter which economic strata you are in, music naturally comes. I mean, there are film music all around, and if you go slightly deeper, then you will also get exposed to classical music through various inputs. So yes, and when you hear music and then you see patterns, and you try to mentally analyze those patterns and see the pattern, do the pattern recognition. That's how, at least in my personal case, identifying ragas in different songs, or having seen a raga, having heard a raga in one classical song and comparing it to a film song, that kind of an analytical approach definitely helps in looking at a data. So is there any pattern in a particular data? Because I stay in spectroscopy. So spectroscopy is nothing but you have a look at a lot of data. Of course, these days it is being looked upon by machine, and whatever human is not able to recognize the pattern, the machine is able to recognize that pattern. Just to also slightly digress, there is a. Can you believe that this theory of probability? I'm sure students of high school mathematics or even undergrads mathematics, they would be studying it in the school and in their text, where to calculate probability you apply a formula, and that formula is NPR is equal to n factorial by NCR is equal to n factorial by r factorial into n minus r factorial. But when in my own reading, if I discovered that this formula in a very different way is given by somebody who is an encyclopedic in nature. It is found in a chapter to make perfumes. How to make perfumes when there are 16 base perfumes, you choose 4 at a time, how to make perfumes. And that answer comes out to be 1820 multiplied by 24. So you see the way things which are various perfumery and cosmetics, and where is probability, combinatorials. But how these two are merged? Similarly, the combinatorials, we find it emerging in the grammar of poetry in Sanskrit. So, from very early on, these things fascinated me, and kind of the language also is very lucid, very beautifully put in Sanskrit. Of course, I am not an expert in Sanskrit, but thanks to the school education that there was a subject of Sanskrit in our generation, at least we could sustain that knowledge. So these things fascinated me, and then as I kept reading more on them, my interest grew further. And I see that today we may use very bombastic, sophisticated terms in pedagogy or in borrowed from the Western corpus. But then back then, when we look at our ancestors' intellectual labor, the work, the kind of depth that they have gone into is mind-boggling, and that's what keeps me fired up to look at these texts and keep moving forward.
I think that's a really fascinating perspective on the interlinking of science and art and how you look at it from an analytical point of view. I think that's really interesting. So, finally, what message would you like to share with the students who wish to pursue research at the intersection of modern chemistry, traditional knowledge, and interdisciplinary scholarship?
Yeah, this is a very again a beautiful question. Again, as Einstein said, research will no longer be a source of passion, or it will not be passionate research if it becomes a source of your income. So, if Albert Einstein could say that from Europe, and being Einstein, because Einstein is after all Einstein, it has got various ramifications for us to deeply understand, because research is a different devil altogether. For a middle class family, even for a higher middle class family, when we classify any family with middle class or lower class or upper class, it is with respect to the financial backing that I am talking about, not with respect to anything else. Research becomes a luxury for people who are in the middle economic state of the society. So, even a decision to come into research has to be had to be calibrated with this economic status of your particular family. So much so that when I was in college, I still remember an ISc professor coming and giving us a lecture. He said that doing research is as good as doing tapasya after you take sannyasa. Back then, we were wondering that, okay, he is only trying to use figurative speech, very polished words. But then, having been in the research field at least now for the past 20 to 20, nearly close to 25 years now, it is really true that if you want to do good research, it is no less than a tapasya. So, and what that good research should be directed towards, and that is where we have lots and lots of contradictions coming into picture. Basic research, applied research. There is a particular shift in the funding pattern in this government, because this is now given more importance to startup as well as products. You translate your research into some kind of a product, which is an applied research. So, government will have its own priority. So, you need to see where you are fitting in. Why I am giving this a long background is, your question is in fact very niche question on research in tradition, in the interplay of tradition and modern science. This prelude that I gave as an answer is in fact for people who are getting into even research itself. If you have answered those questions, if you have surpassed that prelude, now comes the interplay between tradition and modern research. There I would still say we are at a very naive stage as far as government is concerned in supporting or propagating the traditional science. It is hardly 5 years that the NEP has come, which has laid stress on the traditional knowledge, and it is hardly 3 years that the IKS cell is formed. So, it is too naive and early a stage for anybody to jump into this field with all confidence. I am not scaring anybody, but this is a hard reality with which I see it. So, what to do? Get confidence, establish yourself first in the conventional research that is currently going on in places. And how do you establish yourself? Publish peer reviewed papers. Produce results by which you can When I say peer reviewed, because these days there are mushrooming journals where every street will have a publishing house where they can produce journals, and everything will start with the word international journal of whatever it is. You look at, select a particular journal which is worth the paper on which it is printed. There are peer reviewed journals, although not all peer reviewed are sacrosanct. This COVID experience also showed us a lot of negative examples where, as a reputed journal like Lancet, how allegations are now coming up that how they compromised with the data about the vaccination drugs and all. So that, be that as it may, about the controversy about peer review and other things, the fundamental point I am trying to make is establish yourself first in a conventional field. Secure your feet strongly and develop confidence, and then diverge into this unexplored, pristine field where lots and lots of problems have to still get solved. Many people, what happens once they start publishing 2 or 3 peer reviewed papers in a good impact, highly cited journals, they get into a template and they develop an apathy towards anything that is traditional. I have several friends of mine, colleagues of mine, who feel that I am doing well publishing this in either ACS, ACS is one publishing house from America in my field, or for that matter even Springer or the Royal Society, and my career I am able to make by publishing there. So they develop an apathy towards anything that is outside that particular box, whereas science or education should actually have our mind open. We should be open, approach any subject with an open mind. Yes, we take up certain traditional problems, we try to understand it with the modern gadgets and equipments that we have, and announce the world whatever results we have got. Whether it is palatable or not, it is for the society to think. But why should we have a preconditioned or a preconceived notion that I am only associated with the modern science, and even if an iota of thought about the traditional things come, I will be kind of retrogressing. This mental stigma is what I see it in several people. I mean, I can only urge that when you think of doing this kind of an interplay research within the interplay, first get rid of the stigma. More importantly, interact with people of opposite complementary domain. Like in my own field, the texts are written in Sanskrit and very classical Tamil. Although my mother tongue is Tamil, I know little bit of Sanskrit. Both of them do not help me in understanding the technical texts, the language with which they are written. So it is mandatory on my part to sit with language experts, which I also find a problem amongst many peers, that there is some kind of a stigma to interact. I am a science person, why should I go and talk to a language person? Similarly, on the other side, I am a Sanskrit scholar, why should I bother about what these people are doing in the lab with chemicals? That kind of a stigma should go away, both should come on the same, shake hands with each other, sit, and then this research between the interplay of so-called contemporary and traditional science will be able to take pace and proceed further.
I think that's an incredibly real take coming from somebody with your expertise about everything and how we need to be more open minded about the interweaving of art, sciences, literature, and modern sciences and traditional knowledge. And we are very glad to have you, and thank you for your insight. I'm sure all of us and people who are watching and aspiring students appreciate it very much. Thank you on behalf of Amrita and everybody watching. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.